Before we go any farther, a quiet warning. Tonight's story deals with slavery, coercion, and the way a ledger can turn blood into numbers. It isn't told to shock for shock's sake. It's told because the record books left blank spaces, and sometimes the only way to see what lived in those blanks is to follow one house through a long, terrible night. If you've ever stood along a Gulf Coast levee in late summer, you know the smell I'm talking about. Wet heat, cypress and mud, the sweet sting of crushed cane, and a hint of iron that rises from the river like a warning. In 1860, the Delaney place sat a few miles upriver from New Orleans, close enough to hear a steamboat whistle if the wind turned right. 200 acres, half in cane, and the rest in cotton, with a house that had ideas above its station. 2 stories of weathered clapboard, and a line of columns that pretended to be marble when the sun hit them clean. On paper, it looked respectable. In the corners where paper couldn't reach, things were already coming apart. Clement Delaney wasn't the baron he wanted the parish to see. He was a middling man with a gambler's eyes, the kind that twitch when the numbers on the table start leaning the wrong way. He kept 15 enslaved people, 8 men, 7 women, and swore to anyone who'd listen that he worked the fields alongside them because it kept him honest. The truth was meaner. It kept him afloat. His wife Joanna moved through rooms that never felt like hers, smoothing tablecloths, moving a vase a finger's width to center it, listening for a peace that never settled. Their 3 daughters were the house's light and its mirror. Arlene with the quiet assurance of a firstborn, Caroline with a careful grace that made you worry if a breeze came wrong, and Frida with a laugh that had not yet learned to hide. They were all of age young, but grown standing shoulder to shoulder on the veranda, like promises the house whispered to itself about the future. Promises don't pay notes. A blistering blight hit the cane the year before. Then a flood took out a line of fencing and 2 mules, and Clement did what he always did when a door closed. He walked into a room where men played cards, and he opened another. He came home light in the wallet and heavy with the kind of silence that makes everybody else hold their breath. Creditors began to appear with the regularity of crows. They dressed like respectability and spoke like knives. Execution of debt, they said, and attachment, and collateral. The words piled up like a thunderhead no one could look away from. It was in that weather that Clement found the word that would ruin them. He was in his father's office, a room that smelled of old pepper and varnish and the faint ghost of pipe smoke. The ledger he opened was 20 years thick with numbers, ink raised like scabs, cotton bales tallied, barrels of molasses, sacks of seed, mending, nails. And there, at the bottom of a page that had to have been written on a winter night, the handwriting tight from cold one line in a different hand. Increase. 3. The ink was brown and faded, but the meaning was perfectly alive. Children born to enslaved women. 3 new lives converted by law into capital, booked like profit. If you've never heard the Latin, it goes like this: Partus sequitur ventrum. The child follows the condition of the mother. It's the kind of phrase that passes easy at a dinner table until you've sat with it long enough to see the trap room it opens. Clement sat with it. The trap room yawned. Somewhere between the last debt notice and the next hand of cards, the ledger began speaking louder than anyone else in his house. He didn't invent everything that followed. He studied. He took trips to the city under the pretense of seeing a man about seed. He spent evenings in the back of a Chartres Street tavern, where the floor sloped and a man with a narrow mouth sold papers that turned lead into gold for the desperate. The man's name on the street was Bogard. The papers he forged could convince a casual eye that a child born in the big house had been born in the quarters, and to a woman whose name could be written in another column than the one truth put her in. A counterfeit priest would put a drop of river water on a forehead and call it baptism. A counterfeit clerk would copy the false name into a parish register that would outlive everyone who watched him write. A counterfeit mercy would follow each little lie, telling the liar his hands were clean. Joanna watched her husband with the alertness of a person who has begun to suspect there's a second house inside the house she walks through every day. She caught him more than once with a law book open and a page pinned under his palm, as if he didn't want the words to get away. When she stepped into the room, he would close the cover softly, as if to keep the book asleep, and smile the polite smile of a man refusing to admit he'd been somewhere he shouldn't. She started praying at odd hours. She started counting the steps to the nursery without meaning to. The enslaved people felt the shift first. Laya, who worked in the big house and whose hands moved like a skilled seamstress even when she was shelling peas, noticed the way Clement's questions began to turn inward. He asked about sleep and appetite. He asked about womanly cycles, with a doctor's coldness and a buyer's interest. He asked about aches that came and went, and whether the aches had anything to do with the moon. Tobias, who had the kind of strength that made other men ask him to lift things so they could complement his ease, noticed locks appearing in places that had never needed locks, and rules that assumed someone was going to run even before anyone thought about running. New Orleans heard the change, too, in the unkind clang of an auctioneer's bell. Even men used to counting human beings like horses wrinkled their noses when Clement, a man not rich enough to be as cold as he was pretending, inquired about proven women and likely girls, with the zeal of a clerk inventorying bales. Dr. McCormick, a local physician who moved through houses like this one, with the defeated competence of a person who knew exactly how far his help could reach, visited one afternoon for a minor fever and left with a worry he couldn't shape into a sentence. On the path home, he told himself he'd misread things. The part of him that knew better folded its hands and waited. Here is the part many historians argue about at conferences and in footnotes, the part with the phrase breeding farms that some call myth and others call mask. But you don't need a sign on a gate to know what happened inside it. All you need is a ledger that treats a child like a dividend and a man desperate enough to read it that way. Clement began managing. He separated quarters that had always been grouped by kinship and work into arrangements that obeyed a different logic. He wrote down dates with the precision of a ship's captain. He posted rules in places where rules hadn't been necessary. He told himself he was making order. He was making a schedule. He didn't say his plan out loud to Joanna. He didn't say it to the daughters. He didn't even write it directly where any stranger could see. He tested boundaries the way river water tests a levee. First, he tightened the house's social world until it was a fist. Invitations excused. Visits postponed. Letters that arrived from friends went missing and were later found opened, then were later not found at all. He added new locks to the daughters' bedrooms and called them Prudence. He consulted a Creole woman named Marie for tonics that he said would stabilize feminine constitutions, a phrase ugly enough to do the hiding work he wanted done. The bottle smelled like bitter roots and crushed seeds. Caroline gagged at the taste. Arlene kept the bottle corked and pretended. Frida set hers in a window so the sun would strike it and make it look emptied more quickly. One hot night, when the mosquitoes sounded like a sawmill and the moon lifted through the oaks like something being pulled with effort, Clement called Arlene into his office. The door clicked shut behind her like a stamp on a paper. When she did not emerge for a long time, Joanna stood at the end of the hall and listened to the hush that follows a sentence no one in any house should ever hear. The logic he explained was the logic of men who need to believe they live inside a system, not a cruelty. The debt is not a choice, he said. The law is the law. A father sacrifices for his family. Now, a daughter must. Arlene answered with the calm of a person who believes she can still speak to a human being. No. The next day, the locks meant for prudence became locks meant for prison. There are some details a story shouldn't reproduce, not because they didn't happen, but because repeating them in full grants them a second victory. It is enough to say that Clement tried to turn the women in his house, his daughters, 2 of the enslaved women who worked the big house, and eventually even the timing of bread baking and hymn singing into a schedule that served a column on his ledger. It is enough to say that Tobias and 2 other men were threatened into roles that made them ill to hold, and that Leah and an older midwife named Bess stood between the women and as much of the harm as they could catch with their bodies and their wits. It is enough to say the nights got longer even when the days should have. 3 things began to happen at once, as they do in stories like this and in the histories that seed them. First, the forged papers started arriving from the city, neat lines of script that lied well, and a priest's mark that tried to make the lie feel blessed. Second, the house's rhythms, which had once run on cooking and washing, and the ceremony of evening shifted into a secret timetable that could never be spoken aloud. And third, the other houses along the river started to notice how quiet the Delaney's had become. Quiet is a sign like smoke. The question is whether your neighbors are the kind who see it and send water, or the kind who close their shutters and call it weather. The first child born under the new order came on a breathless June morning when the heat had already stained the sky by breakfast. Arlene labored in the room Joanna had once painted a lighter color to lure wind through it, the same room where she had set a cradle that came down Joanna's line and smelled faintly of cedar and old milk. Bess coached in a voice that made even Clement step back. Tobias stood outside the door and held the frame with both hands, like a man holding a bridge. The baby took air at last and wailed. Arlene reached, and Clement, with a speed that looked like practiced fear, took the child and carried him out. It is a kind of magic, the way a house can be 2 houses at once. In one, the first sound a mother hears is an answer to her body's every ache and prayer. In the other, the first sound is a number. The forged certificate arrived a week later, with Leah's name where Arlene's should have been. The boy was sold 3 weeks after that to a trader who talked about him like he was a yearling. The money paid a slice of a note and bought Clement a night's sleep that didn't last long. Arlene stopped talking for 3 days. When she started again, it was to tell Joanna that the cradle could be given away. There would be no need for it here. Caroline's child followed in August after a labor so bad that Dr. McCormick summoned under a pretense, sat in his buggy afterward for an hour without trusting himself to move. He took Clement's money and told himself pragmatic lies all the way home. He did not sleep. The baby pale, healthy, uncomprehending vanished behind papers and hands that never once said his name. Frida's turn came late in autumn, and though she had only just turned 18 and still wore her hair, the way girls do when they've not yet learned to armor themselves, the house did not let her be young. Her delivery broke something in her that strength couldn't fix. She woke and asked for her child, and drifted under when the answer didn't come. There are nights a house remembers and won't talk about. When winter came with a thin frost morning that left a lace pattern on the water trough, one of those nights arrived. The clocks in the big house ticked as if they were lifting weight. Joanna walked the hall with a lamp and a prayer that didn't know what words it wanted. Somewhere near dawn, the prayer gave up trying to be words and became a decision. A mother can only watch a fire spread for so long before she throws water or opens a door and screams for a bucket line. Joanna had been opening a door to God and whispering, "Please." That night, she opened a different door. She went to the quarters as the sky paled like a bruise. Men and women looked up from the small fires where they heat-coaxed breakfast from pots and ashes. She asked for Tobias. She asked for Bess. She asked, with a voice that shook at the edges but held in the middle, for help. Bess did not blink. Tobias looked past Joanna at the house, then back at Joanna, and nodded once, like a man accepting a burden that answers the question of his life. In the weeks that followed, what had been a system became a siege. Joanna moved like a woman who had found the key to a door and wasn't going to return it. She began intercepting small things, letters that might have become orders, bottles that might have become schedules, visits ostensibly for supplies that were actually for the maintenance of lies. She watched Clement the way a hunter watches weather. She learned the nights he went into the parish to play cards and the alley he cut through on his way back to the river road. She put away the lace collar she wore when she wanted people to think of her as delicate. She started wearing her hair pinned tight like a working woman who expects to move quickly. Clement sensed something and mistook it for luck breaking against him. He doubled down on order. He bought more locks. He kept the ledgers closer. He held himself straighter in the saddle, as if posture could put the wind back into a man. He recalculated his scheme with cool arithmetic. 5 women of childbearing age, his daughters among them, staggered in cycles, could bring 2, maybe 3 infants to market each year, if care was taken and complications were treated like inefficiencies to be corrected rather than suffering to be addressed. He told himself he was saving the house. He told himself men had done worse in war. He told himself anything he could think of that made his face look like a face he could shave in the morning. And here is where the river that runs under recorded history surfaced and spoke. Silence is a tool the powerful use. It is also the one thing the powerless can take away. Bess began to talk to women in murmurs that grew into words that were not apology or prayer. "Not again," she said. "Not this way." She made tea that steadied hands and hid a bitterness strong enough to stop a schedule when a body decided it could bear no more. She taught 3 women to breathe in a pattern that looked like calming but was actually signal. Tobias gathered 2 men you could trust at your back and 1 young boy who ran like a deer and never boasted about it. They started taking locks off doors as quietly as Clement put them on. The night it all turned began like any other heat, even after sundown. Thunder stacked at the horizon, a flock of egrets squabbling in a stand of willow. Clement left after supper for the tavern, where the lamp chimneys were always one cleaning behind, and the dealer liked to tap the table twice after each hand to remind you he wasn't your friend. Joanna watched him go, then blew out the parlor lamp and went to the place in the yard, where the path from town narrowed between a pair of leaning oaks. Tobias stepped out of the shadow so softly even the crickets didn't answer. He put a hand on the oak and looked like a man asking a question only a tree could answer. When he met Joanna's eyes, they both stopped being the people they were supposed to be and became the people the night required. Storms in the Delta have a way of making the world feel smaller and more honest. The rain came hard, loud on the leaves, soft on the dirt, the kind of rain that makes a bad road into a story the next morning. Clement's horse clopped, then slid, then recovered, breath loud as a bellows. Clement himself sang a verse of a song he thought men who had money sang in parlors. He was drunk enough to believe he was a kind of man he had never been. When the shape rose from the ditch, a shape with a stick that swung in a clean arc and found the place where a man stops thinking, there wasn't time for a speech. Some accounts say Joanna cried out. Some say she didn't. The only thing certain is the way the rain washed the path almost clean, and the way a robbery looked simpler to understand than a house that had finally saved itself. In the morning, a farmer found the body and said the thing people say when a bad story makes their own life feel steadier. Such a shame. Sheriff Mullins came with a hat that didn't fit his head and an air of authority that was really a habit. He poked at the mud. He looked at the horse's knees. He picked up a coin that must have shaken loose from a pocket when the body landed. "Bandits," he announced, in the tone of a man who knows he won't be contradicted by anyone who matters. He wrote a few lines in the tidy hand of a clerk who enjoys his letters. He went home to a dinner that tasted like every other dinner he'd eaten that month. A house can change its temperature without moving a single stick of furniture. After Clement's burial quick, respectable, supervised by neighbors who liked a funeral because it offered an opportunity to measure one another's grief, Joanna moved through the rooms with a new gravity. She opened the nursery and opened the windows and let July crash through the house like a blessing. She told the enslaved people they were free, and if those words fell with more hope than logistics at first, they were still true enough to start a future. She sent notice to a man who had made an offer on 2 presses and a wagon. She told Arlene quietly that if a baby came, the baby would stay and would be called by his right name, even if it had to be whispered. She told Caroline that rest is a kind of courage no one honors enough. She sat with Frida and held her, while Frida shook and said she couldn't stand even the sound of footsteps in the hall. She told Frida the footsteps would change, and then she walked the hall herself until the house learned her rhythm. Not every wound stops just because the hand that made it is gone. Arlene carried a 3rd pregnancy, like a person carrying both a candle and a pail of water, ready for either. The birth nearly killed her. It also gave the house its first intact cry that wasn't followed by the sound of a door closing. She named the boy Thomas because it felt like a name that could stand on its own and didn't need a story attached to hold it up. Caroline learned to sit on the veranda with a shawl even in heat, and watch the river the way a person watches a loved one sleep, not expecting anything to change, silently begging for it anyway. Frida walked again, slowly, with Tobias's arm for balance and a stick Bess carved for her that had a vine running up its length like a promise. If you're listening and waiting for the part where the law arrives with a book and a pen and writes the truth so that the truth will stay, I can't give you that. The law wrote robbery in ink that lasted. It wrote melancholy on a slip that explained a death that had another cause entirely. What didn't get written lived anyway. It lived in the way Joanna handled paper after that, carefully, but without fear. It lived in Laia, who left for New Orleans and used the very needle that had once mended the master's shirts to earn money that belonged to her. It lived in Tobias, who took his strength north and lifted other things that needed lifting, then didn't talk about the night in the Oaks unless a man's grief required the confession and could hold it. Some stories end like a door closing. This one thins out like fog when the sun finally pushes through. The Delaney land became parcels with other names. The big house, robbed of its false purposes, sagged and then fell. And a man with more heart than business sense carried away the good boards to build a barn that never creaked in the wind. People forgot the exact location of the grave in a corner of the family plot where the grass is thicker, and maybe that's for the best. What shouldn't be forgotten is how easily a number in a ledger can become a plan when a man believes the law exists to bless his need. What shouldn't be forgotten is how often the end of such a plan comes not from a judge, but from a woman who decides a door must be opened, and a man who decides to stand beside her. You may ask if this particular family sat in this particular house. You may want names and a map you can point to, and a photograph where a face gives itself away. The truth is messier, and to my ear, truer. This story is a composite born from receipts, testimonies gathered by WPA interviewers, whose pencils paused at the worst places, bills of sale that mentioned increase, with the same calm they used for nails and rope, and the kind of rumors that are only called rumors because the men who could have made them records chose not to write them down. If you go hunting the archives long enough, you will find pieces that fit too well to ignore. But before you start thinking of paper and forgetting people, listen to the house one last time. It says the midwife's back ached for the rest of her life, and she never again drank tea without thinking of the day she brewed the kind that stopped a timetable. It says Caroline lived long and quiet, and sometimes laughed in winter when the air was so clear you could see far, and she could pretend far was closer than it is. It says Arlene taught Thomas to read from a Bible that had too many corners turned down at the book of Exodus, and smiled whenever he mouthed the word, deliver. It says Frida painted the stick Bess carved for her with a strip of blue she made from crushed laundry indigo, and when passers-by asked what the color meant, she said simply, I kept moving. There is something else the house says if you're patient. It says that men in town continued to use the word order the way Clement had, and in other houses, other ledgers grew the column called increase, as if it were a crop that obeyed the weather. And in those houses, too, a night arrived when someone stood in a corridor and said a word that stops a machine. Sometimes that word was no. Sometimes it was a name spoken fully. Sometimes It was a prayer that turned into a plan. None of those words made the records. All of them changed what happened next. If you're still with me, sitting in the dark with the hum of your own house around you and the flick of a screen like a candle, let the last image be a simple one. A river moving past a shore that has seen more than any one story can hold, carrying silt and secrets and the ash of old houses out to the Gulf, where even the ugliest things dissolve if you give them enough water and time. Somewhere along that shore, a boy named Thomas, whose first sound was answered with arms that wouldn't let go, learns to throw a stone farther than he could yesterday. He does not know the names of every tree along the bank. He does not need to. He knows the sound a levee makes when it holds. He knows what a door sounds like when it opens, and air that had been kept out rushes through. He knows because his mother taught him, and because a house once learned it the hardest way, that numbers on a page don't get to decide what a life is worth. And if, later, a stranger asks him whether the story of the Delaney place is real, he will say what true stories always say when they are asked to choose a shelf. It happened, not the way a clerk would write it, but in the way a night changes a house, and a house changes the people who refuse to let the worst thing be the last thing. He will say a name, and then he will say another, and by the time he is done, the ledger will be the quietest thing in the room. He will say a name, and then he will say another, and by the time he is done, the ledger will be the quietest thing in the room. What he won't say, because no one ever does when they are trying to make sense of a past that still breathes, is how the days immediately after the burial felt like moving furniture in a house that was listing. You can shift weight to one side and keep it from going under, but every board in the place knows the river still wants it. Word of Clement's death traveled downstream faster than driftwood. Men who liked to pretend they were above gossip discussed it at the counter of the feed store, with the same solemn relish they used for funerals of people richer than themselves. "Bandits," they said, and they spat the word into the dust, as if the dust might take offense. Women folded the news into their aprons and carried it home with their flour, and some put a hand to a throat that remembered the feel of a man's fingers, even when they weren't there. 2 weeks after the funeral, a letter came, hand-delivered by a boy from the landing who had learned to run messages for coins and secrets. The paper was thick and smug, the ink black as the inside of a bottle. There was no signature at the bottom, only a small flourish like a fishhook. The words were polite enough to make Joanna's teeth ache. They reminded her that debts did not die with men, only change their address. They also inquired purely for the sake of order, whether certain arrangements had been maintained, because an operation of such promise oughtn't to be allowed to fall into neglect for sentimental reasons. The boy who brought the letter scuffed at the porch with his toe, while she read and pretended he did not see the color rising in her face. That night, the river air tasted like pennies. Joanna sat at the desk, where Clement used to sit, and opened drawers she had never been invited to open. Beneath a folded map of parish lines, beneath a box of brass buttons, beneath a roll of banknotes bound with string that had dried stiff with sweat, she found it. The ledger that had learned to speak to him. The first pages were the kind of accounting any house might keep. Seed, feed, shoeing, molasses, calico, nails. Then the handwriting changed, clenched, became the tight thread of a man pulling too hard on a rope. Numbers marched down the margin like soldiers. And there, written so neatly she wanted to tear the page for its nerve, the column he had whispered into being. Increase. She could have burned it. Many women did with papers that had brought a spell into their homes, but fires give off light, and light can be seen downriver. She closed the book carefully, as if by denying its drama she could deny its power, wrapped it in muslin, and slid it into the false bottom of a chest that had once kept christening gowns. Then she went to the window and watched the lightning far out over the marsh, counting the seconds to the thunder the way she had when she was a girl, and the world still answered to numbers you could trust. In the morning, she sent word to Laya. New Orleans had already fallen to Union blue, and the city wore occupation like an ill-fitting suit. Bayonets flashed where parasols used to, and the sound of boots on flagstones changed the tempo of Jackson Square. Laya moved through that new city the way practical women always do. Eyes down when it was wise, up when it was necessary, hands always busy in a way that made other people underestimate how much she was seeing. She'd found a room off Poydras and work in a seamstress shop that faced a narrow alley, smelling of onions and river water. The owner was a widow who swore at needles and customers with the same heartfelt creativity. Laya liked the honest curses. After years of words used to hide, frankness felt like baptism. They met at the French market early, when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the lamplighter was yawning his way home. They did not embrace. They were not foolish. They walked past stalls, where fish stared with the flat eyes of things that have seen too much, past heaps of greens, still breathing dew, and stopped near a pile of cane sugar bricks that looked like someone had stacked small coffins. "He wrote," Joanna said without showing the letter, "and I found his book." Laya kept her face still. Then he had a partner. More than one. There's a name I've half heard. A man who sits over a tavern with papers in a case. Bogard, Laya said, and it was not a question. He used to come to the market with a priest who never looked anyone in the eye. "Can you find him?" "I can find the room above the tavern," Laya said. "Whether he is in it will be the river's decision. What do you want with him?" Joanna could have said justice. She could have said confession. Instead, because she had learned that the only thing that beats a ledger is another ledger, she said, "His records." They worked out a plan like women choosing dried beans, rejecting one for everyone they kept. Laya would find the stairs. Joanna would remain as invisible as a lady could when the world insisted on noticing her. If there was a valise, it would be heavy. If there was a man with it, he would be precisely as brave as money makes men. They did not have to wait long. The tavern above which Bogard kept his counterfeit sacraments was a long room with a low ceiling and a window that never admitted enough light to expose anyone fully. In the afternoons, soldiers came to exchange pay for oblivion. In the evenings, men with coats too nice for honest work came to exchange whispers for gold. Around noon, it was nearly empty. Laya went in first with a basket of mended shirts, the universal passport of women in that city. Joanna took the stairs in twos, gloved hand on the rail, the kind of figure no one challenged, because it was easier not to. Bogard was exactly what such men always are when they think they are hidden, ordinary to the point of offense. Narrow face, narrow shoulders, narrow soul. The valise on the table was not narrow. It looked heavy enough to make a promise. "Sir," Joanna said in the tone men had trained themselves to obey without thinking. He turned, blinked, half-bowed, already calculating the price of whoever had sent this white lady to his door. "Madam, you seem lost." "I seem exactly where I mean to be," Joanna said, and the firmness in her voice surprised even her. "You sold my husband papers he had no right to buy." Bogard smiled the way men smile when they think they've found someone they can own by knowing her shame. "Your husband was a man of enterprise. We all do what is necessary." "We are not all the same kind of hungry," she said, and moved closer. The valise smelled faintly of leather and mildew and ink. "You kept copies." "Prudence," he said, tapping the case with a finger as pale as a candle. "For my safety. For my leverage. For posterity." "Open it," Joanna said. He tilted his head as if listening to a joke she had not told. "And why should I?" "Because I didn't come alone." Bogard's eyes flicked past Joanna at the door, where Laya had appeared, and now leaned with the ease of a woman who had attended to men's foolishness long enough to be bored by it. He misread the situation entirely. He thought leverage meant muscle, and muscle looked to him like the men who carried ship's ropes. He did not know yet that leverage in this room looked like two women who had decided they were done being spoken for. He opened the case. Inside, stacked in folders tied with cheap ribbon, lay the kind of order evil likes best. Clean. Labeled. Sortable. Birth certificates with names lined up like soldiers for inspection. Baptismal records with dates that meant something to mothers, but nothing to the men who had written them. Notes in a tight hand that reduced babies to marks and margins. Pale, dark, healthy, frail, as if any description could summarize a life. Joanna felt something fall through her. It wasn't surprise. It was weight. She reached out and lifted one paper. She did not touch it with gloves. She wanted some honest stain on it, something human. Bogard began to speak because men like him cannot stand silence when it isn't theirs. He named prices the way an auctioneer names lot numbers. He explained, as if giving a schoolboy lesson, how the law made these papers possible. He smiled when he said the Latin. "Partus sequitur ventrum," he said, pleased with himself for having paid attention in some room where he didn't belong. "The child follows the belly. The child follows his mother," Joanna said, and the way she said, "mother," made even Laya glance at her. "I can sell you these," he continued. "If you are wise, you will pay my fee, and we will call this a change of supplier. If you are foolish, you will threaten me. And then I will take these to a man with a tin star who prefers his justice stackable." "Tin stars are in short supply in this city," Laya said softly, and it was true. Union blue stepped where parish badges used to. Joanna closed the case with one finger, gently, as if settling a child into sleep. "You will bring these to my carriage this evening," she said. "All of them. There will be payment. If anything is missing, I will speak to a provost who owes me a kindness. He may not care about the names of children, but he cares very much about the papers that make this occupation seem righteous. He will be delighted to parade you through a square." Bogard faltered. He had thought he was the only person in the room who knew how to use other men's vanity as a tool. He did not know how to price the kind of woman who had learned to live without sleeping, and who had stopped believing that shame could be used against her. He nodded. He tried to make the nod look like a choice. They walked out into a heat that was already laying hands on foreheads. Laia exhaled without opening her mouth. Joanna's gloves were damp. "You think he will run," Joanna said. "I think men like him believe there is a city where their tricks still work. But I also think he likes his things more than he fears any woman." They were both right. He delivered the case, looking wounded by his own temporary obedience, and tried to follow at a gentleman's distance as Joanna's driver turned the horse for home. Laia peeled off at a corner, then reappeared behind him the way women do when a city is their garment. When he discovered he had lost them, he swore in the alley under his breath because he did not want the lamplighter to hear him and think him common. Back at the house, Joanna set the case on the kitchen table because that was the part of the house that knew what to do with things men had ruined. Bess came in from the yard with her apron already dusted with flour. She set down a bowl she had been cutting biscuits into and wiped her hands on a towel that had seen births and deaths and 100 ordinary days between. Joanna opened the case again, and the air in the room changed, as if the windows had been opened and every memory had chosen to come inside at once. "Do we burn it?" Joanna asked. Bess looked at the papers as if they were a child with a fever. "If we burn it, it dies easy. If we keep it, it fights on our side. We will need it when men come asking how we know what we know." "Men aren't coming," Joanna said. "Some will," Bess said. "Maybe not for us. Maybe for someone else downriver. But when they do, we hand them the truth and make them carry it." And so the case didn't burn. It slid into the chest beside the ledger, and the house took on the careful, paranoid order of places that have learned that papers can be both weapon and wound. Every sound became a question. Every rider on the road was a messenger or an enemy until he passed the gate. Every night carried the possibility that Bogard would return with the kind of men who love lanterns more than light. He didn't come back that week. Instead, the war came closer in the way wars do, in small regulations, in uniforms at markets, in rumors that moved through the parish like snakes under grass. New teachers with northern voices came to the city and opened schools where they taught boys and girls whose names the ledgers had tried to erase to hold a pencil and make letters stand at attention. A woman from Boston read from a book and laughed too loudly when she was frightened. A black preacher whispered the Psalms into courtyards in a cadence that will outlast every courthouse. The world felt both nearer and stranger. Men who had once looked at Joanna with that careful local courtesy now admired her in the way men do when a woman's suffering has made her interesting. She did not enjoy the attention, not even when it made things easier to get. Arlene's boy learned to grip her finger and be fed and sleep in the curve of a body that meant him safety. Caroline learned a discipline of mourning that made panic sit down and hush. Frida, who had once believed stairs impossible, walked them determinedly, one at a time, and swore at them under her breath with a creativity that would have made the seamstress in New Orleans proud. Dr. McCormick began to arrive at odd hours, with satchels clinking softly, left on the back step like contraband. He didn't knock. He set the bag down and walked away, and returned in the afternoon, as if he'd just thought to stop by. Inside the bag were glass bottles and gauze, and a letter he had written to himself, and then to someone else, the way men practice telling a truth before they dare to speak it aloud. I took money to keep my mouth because I told myself it would let me keep other people alive. This is not a defense. It is a confession and a debt. Tell me where to send payment." He never mailed it. He brought it to Bess, who read it with a mouth gone thin, and then tucked it into the case with the forged baptisms, because even weak repentance is a kind of evidence. That autumn, after a long dry spell that turned the cane a crisp, whispering brown, a trio of riders came clattering up the lane at sundown, with the entitled clumsiness of men who expect doors to open in front of them, because doors always have. They wore no uniforms, but they wore the kind of faces that make good men lower their eyes, rather than start a fight that will continue for generations. The tallest among them had a hand too smooth for his age. "Mrs. Delaney," he said, as if tasting the letters, "we hear tell you've been tampering with order in this parish." "I've been selling surplus," Joanna said, which was true in one sense and absolutely unhelpful in another. "We hear tell you freed your niggers." He said the word with the bored relish of a man turning a spit. "They freed themselves," Joanna said. "I merely said so out loud." The smooth-handed man smiled, as if he had just decided where to set down his boot. "There's law and there's custom. Law changes. Custom keeps a roof on a house." He lifted his chin toward the big house, which looked back at him without affection. "We aim to keep roofs where they belong." Bess stepped into the doorway behind Joanna, with a shotgun she had cleaned that morning and propped against the wall, because that is the kind of thing you do when you sense how a day will go. She did not raise it. She let it be seen. Tobias appeared from the yard, not close enough to be a provocation, close enough to be a fact. The riders calculated and found their numbers wanting. "We'll be back," the smooth-handed man said, "because men always say that when what they mean is I'm leaving, and I need to feel bigger as I go." They were back 2 nights later, with faces under hoods that had been cut from feed sacks, and their pride hidden like a child's toy under a bed. They burned a pile of cane by the road to remind everyone the world still had sharp teeth. Tobias and 2 men he trusted did the same arithmetic again and decided not to shoot anyone that night. Instead, they doused the fire with buckets from the well and stood in a line that made the riders feel, for the first time in a long time, that they did not own the dark. Down in the city, Bogard finally misjudged a man in blue whose vanity did not operate the way local vanity did. He tried to sell an officer a sheaf of manumission papers as a way to get a pass for river travel. The officer, who had spent the last month combing through warehouses full of confiscated Confederate cotton and had developed an allergy to lies on paper, took the case as if taking a sandwich and handed it to a clerk, who added it to a pile on a table where the truth was being sorted for future use. Bogard protested with the squeak of a chair leg on stone. The officer glanced at him like a man glancing at a fly. "You can go," he said, "or you can stay and discuss counterfeiting during time of war." Bogard went. He left behind the one thing he had loved purely, his own file of other people's crimes. Months passed, the way months do when a house is trying to outwait a past that will not wash out. Winter came with a thin skin of ice over the horse trough on 2 mornings, and a rumor that the war might end if generals could agree on what the word end should mean. Spring came with bees that made a fence hum and a burst of wisteria that looked like the house exhaling. Arlene started saying Thomas's name without her voice breaking. Caroline helped an abolitionist teacher from the city set up a chalkboard in the ruined carriage house, and children sat where the buggy used to, swinging their legs and sounding out letters, as if letters were birds. They were teaching to perch on a finger. Frida took the stick Bess had carved and drew a line in the dust as straight as a string, and told the little ones to try walking it the way she did when days felt like they might tilt. Then, on a day so bright it made everyone squint, a wagon stopped at the gate with a woman on it, whose face Leia knew too well to let her pass. Marie, the woman who had sold Clement his tonics, climbed down with a bundle under her arm and an expression that looked like pride until you saw the fear behind it. She had left the parish after a whisper about treason and herbs, and witchcraft had made her profession inconvenient. She had a daughter with her, half-grown, eyes watchful. Marie set the bundle on the porch and untied it like someone about to give a gift and asked to be thanked. Inside lay 3 books bound in pasteboard, curled at the edges with humidity. "He asked for what he asked for," she said. "I sold it. I can't unsell it. But I kept notes for my own protection. Names, dates, mixtures. I don't want them anymore." She looked at Joanna's face then, saw the kind of grief that can't be moved by revenge, and dropped her gaze in a hurry. "I thought maybe you could put them somewhere safe." Bess took the books and did not open them right there. Some things you don't put in daylight where they can show their teeth. She set them beside the ledger and the case of baptisms, and the chest began to feel like a small museum for the worst the parish had produced, and the start of the better it might yet. Summer came again, and with it a letter in a neat hand, from an office with a long name that began with the word Bureau and contained the word Freedman. A man with a northern way of forming his vowels wrote that he had been told by a chaplain he was not at liberty to name that there might be documentary evidence of trafficking in children born to free women falsely recorded as enslaved. He asked whether Joanna would consent to speak. He did not promise remedy. He promised record. He promised what history always promises when it is being honest. We can write it down and carry it forward. Whether anything else changes is up to people not in this room. Joanna spoke. She did not tell him everything. She told him enough. She gave him copies of papers, not the originals, because she had learned how easily truth goes missing when it is the only one of its kind. The man from the bureau took the copies in a portfolio that had a clean flap and a fastener that clicked satisfactorily. He said the word, "Thank you," in a tone that sounded less like closing a conversation than opening a door. Some of the people Clement had sold to the city could be traced, not by confession or law, but by the small, stubborn habits of the poor. A woman in the market remembered a man with a scar who bought a child because the child looked like someone the man wanted to punish or replace, and though no one ever established whether that memory was accurate in the way courtrooms demand, it was accurate in the way stories that keep us human need to be. A clerk remembered that a trader named Thibodeau never haggled over infants. He paid quick like a man flushing evidence. A priest, who had dipped counterfeit water on counterfeit names, looked up from his ledger once, and, for the first time in a long time, saw the people standing in front of his desk. He could not undo the past. He agreed to tear out 4 pages. Whether he actually did is a matter of argument. The absence of paper is harder to prove than its presence. What mattered most is that the river of supply was interrupted. Men who thought they had built pipes of secrecy discovered sand in the joints. And in the evenings, when the heat let go enough to allow breath, the house breathed. Arlene told Thomas stories that made heroes of women with flour on their hands. Caroline, whose hands had learned to shake when a door latch clicked wrong, taught her pupils to read the words in the Psalms that promise shadow and refuge, and insisted they learn the words in the Constitution too, because paper can be made to serve the living as well as the dead. Frida started a garden in a corner of ground that had only ever grown confession before. When the first tomatoes reddened like answered prayers, she laughed in a way that made Tobias shake his head and grin. "You beat them," he said, and she said, "I outlived them," because victory, in some places, is measured in seasons. Years slid. The war ended with the kind of abruptness that makes the aftermath feel longer than the event. Men returned who had not been missed. Some wore bitterness like an heirloom. Some wore emptiness, like a wound you cannot touch without flinching. Night riders tried a few more times to announce that the old order wore a new mask, but the parish had grown tired of men who needed costumes to feel large. When the riders set fire to a pile of cane again, 12 men from the quarters, who were no longer quarters because they belonged to themselves, walked out with buckets and beat at the flames with wet sacks and did not run when guns flashed. The riders did the arithmetic again, as men have done from Lexington to now, and decided to remember an appointment elsewhere. Beauregard's end was small, as fitting as it was unsatisfying. He died in a boarding house room near the river with a tin ceiling and a stain that looked like a map of a country no one had drawn yet. The woman who ran the house found him 2 days later when the smell made the other guests stop pretending. Among his things were 3 receipts, a comb with 6 missing teeth, and a key that opened nothing anyone could find. The coroner wrote, "Fever," because that was easier and probably true in the way that mattered to the living. No one came to claim his body. A boy from the market who had once run messages for him took the comb because even a poor comb is better than fingers. The key ended up in a drawer in an office whose clerk liked the feel of weight in his pocket and kept it there until he retired, and then carried it home to show his grandchildren how men used to keep doors. If you stand in a parish courthouse today and ask for the papers, a clerk will bring you a bundle that smells like all old courthouses. Dust, lemon oil, the faint metallic tang of paper clips rusting under time. Among the papers you won't find are the ones that mattered most to the people in this story. They live elsewhere. Some live in a wooden chest that was carried north after a sale, and then west after a wedding, and now sits in a spare room in a house where a woman with hair like a field keeps sewing pins in a teacup by the window. Some live in a bureau archive where a graduate student will one day open a folder and forget to breathe for a moment, because the past is suddenly so near she can feel its heat. Thomas grew. He learned the sound the river makes in different winds. He learned to count not by bales and barrels, but by children boasting across the yard how many letters they knew and how many marbles they had won. He heard the story of his beginning in pieces, because some stories are too heavy for the mouths of the very young, and when he put them together as a man, he did not go to the river to throw stones at the house, where men like his grandfather had thought numbers could tell them what the world owed. He went to the city and found Leah in a storefront, bright with fabric, and said her name like a blessing. And she said, "Look at you," and set down her shears and laughed the laugh she had been saving. The Delaney land became other names. The corner where Frida's garden grew tomatoes became a place where a boy asked a girl to marry him, and she said, "Not yet," which is one of the better answers to that question. The big house lost its roof in a storm and its courage in a winter, and was finally taken down before it could kill someone. Its boards became a wharf shed where fishermen mended nets with a patience the house had never possessed. The nursery window, which had once watched nights it should never have seen, was set into the side of a church where morning light touched pews of people who had discovered that you can sing a building clean if you pick the right hymn and sing it often. There is a holiday now that the town observes in a way that says, both we remember, and we would rather not talk about what exactly we remember. They call it by the name of a saint no one particularly loves, and hand out paper fans stamped with a bank's logo. Children run between tables. Old men tell stories to anyone who will listen, and if you keep your ears open, you will hear the names, not all at once, but in a series you can follow if you've learned how to listen. Bess, who taught 3 midwives and lived to 97 with a spine like a sapling that refused to bend. Tobias, who wrote back from Cincinnati about a river that was wide and kind, and work that left his hands tired in a way that made sleep come easy. Caroline, who became the sort of teacher children remember after they've forgotten what she taught. Frida, who married late to a man with gentle jokes and one bad leg, and who kept a basket on the porch full of sticks just like hers, so visiting children could practice balance with her. Laya, whose quilting circle became a place other women brought their own stories, as if the stitches could keep them from unraveling. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the cicadas are declaring their belief in persistence and the magnolia has opened its thick white mouths, Joanna sits with her shawl despite the heat and allows herself to think of Clement. She does not forgive him. She does not rehearse anger either. Anger is a flame, and flames tire a body if you tend them too long. She thinks instead of the night in the Oaks when the arithmetic of the parish changed. She thinks of the sound Bess's stick made on the step, that tap that was both warning and benediction. She thinks of paper, its lies, and its rescue. She thinks of how a word like increase can be pulled, like a weed, until the ground around it loosens and air gets in. Then she rises, because the kitchen wants its quiet sounds made, and because morning comes, whether we deserve it or not, and because the world has to be readied for children again. If you walk the levee where the house once stood, the wind off the river will press your shirt to your back and carry the sound of 3 different church bells arguing gently about the hour. Someone will be frying catfish in a yard down the road, and the smell of cornmeal will lay itself along the street like an invitation. A freight train will sound its horn far off where the line bends, and a dog will answer, and a woman will call the dog back because the road, like the past, can be dangerous if you don't pay attention. You won't find a marker there. You won't find a plaque. What you will find is space to stand and listen for a house you cannot see anymore, for a ledger that forgot how to talk, for a page that survived because 2 women refused to let a man's pen be the last word. And that, if you are the sort of person who likes your horrors to have endings that sit tidily on a shelf, will have to do. But for the rest of us, who know that the ugliest things echo, there is one more sound worth waiting for. It comes when the sky is the soft purple New Orleans does better than any place on earth, and the bats stitch up the evening like seamstresses working in good light, and you can just make out a boy standing on the levee, a man now, hand shading his eyes as if the future were shining too fiercely. He turns toward a voice behind him, a woman's voice, his mother's, and answers with a word that only ever means itself, and yet, in that instant, means everything. Coming. Because he is. Because they all are. Because the road out of a house like that is longer than a lifetime, and still, somehow, they are making it. Because men wrote ledgers to force a future, and women wrote letters to save one, and the future, against the odds, and the math, and the law that once made cruelty feel clean, chose its authors carefully. And if, on some year's end, you find yourself in the quarter with the St. Louis spires pointed like pens at a sky practicing blankness, and a lamplighter's great-great-grandson lifting his long pole to coax fire into place, and you pass a second-story window where a leather valise sits in the half-dark, don't stop. Don't knock. Don't ask to see what's inside. The woman who owns that room has already opened it. She's added a page with 3 names in a strong hand and tucked a sprig of mint between papers, so the past will smell a little less like itself when she reads it next. Then she closed the case and went downstairs to put on a pot and wait for children, whose homework includes a word they used to avoid and now insist on pronouncing properly. Deliver. The river keeps moving. The house learned to breathe. The ledger learned to be quiet. The rest is work, and it is being done. Even on nights like this when the air sits heavy and the cicadas refuse to let you forget they are there. And the only ghosts are the ones we invite, because without them, we might forget why we are trying so hard to keep the doors open and the documents safe and the babies where they belong.